Welcome to the Richard Dolan Show, where every week we fight the good fight. Greetings. This is a special edition of my program. I suppose that's the best way to put it. For many years, I used to do these programs more or less as a solo operation. If you've been listening to me for a long time, you probably remember that. And I would just give my own thoughts on a whole array of subjects connected to UFOs. And I want to do that for this program. Just because of all of the news that's been happening regarding the subject within the general culture particularly. And I'd like to explore that the best I can and really try to explore the issue, what does this all mean? So I've got a little bit of an outline here, not really hard and fast notes, and I'm just going to go walk through this, and I'm hoping you're going to be able to walk through this with me. We're going to talk about some old truths and some new truths. First, let's get into some of the old truth. The old truth is the truth that I grew up with relating to UFOs. It was the truth that I was dealing with in all of my research connected to the UFO subject for years and years and years. And the old truth is basically that since the 1940s and 50s, there's been a certain situation in place relating to UFOs. A, that UFOs had been ridiculed and dismissed by the establishment. That was a given. B, that there had been countless sightings of UFOs around the world. So there was this tremendous discrepancy that had always struck me as noteworthy, right? This massive reality seen by countless numbers of people, and the fact that there's just been this official silence. I think, for me, that was always the number one thing. With the addition that a lot of the sightings that had occurred over the years, whether by civilians or military people, were often of very exceptional quality, very exceptional caliber. So leaving you with the conclusion that there's an obvious cover-up. And that really, that's the fundamental of the old and, well, we can say even current UFO truth to some extent, but definitely the old truth. But there's more than that. For example, there were always rumors of UFO crashes. There were always rumors of bodies that were acquired from those crashes. At least these rumors really gained a lot of steam starting around the 1970s. But they even existed before that. Now, the whole thing with crashes and bodies for years and years, because researchers never had the material publicly available, that's a really hard sell. But the fact is, the argument for crashes and retrievals has always been a pretty good one. They're the Roswell witnesses, and there's many of those. And if you take the time to look into them, I think you might be inclined to agree that Roswell is a very strong case indeed for a crash retrieval of a UFO. But also some witnesses from other crash retrieval events, including the Aztec UFO crash and a number of others. And then, of course, there was the research of the late Leonard Stringfield, someone that I greatly admire in the UFO field. Stringfield, who interviewed scores and scores, maybe hundreds of individuals connected to some form or another of UFO crash retrieval. Leonard Stringfield was a careful researcher. His work is available. You can get the full 7 volumes of his reports of UFO crash retrieval, status reports. Kind of expensive on Amazon, but they are available. I highly recommend it. So there's a great deal of information on crash retrievals. I think the case for them has been quite strong, but that was always far removed from any official acknowledgement of the UFO subject, obviously. And on top of that, what more has the UFO subject really involved throughout many, many years? Well, one thing is the likelihood of abductions or encounters that people have had with beings, non-human beings, presumably. Another possible thing to consider has been, do these other beings, have they had a long-term presence here? And if so, where are they? What are they doing? All of this is the what more part of the old truth, and as you can see, that part can get very intense indeed. So for 70 years, basically from the 1940s until quite recently, this was the situation. A massive, apparent reality in which researchers wondered, debated, looked into the question of how deep did that reality go? How deep does it go? Versus a total denial of the reality by the establishment right up through really the end of, say, the Barack Obama presidency, right up through the end of 2016 into 2017. We have been in a state of virtual total denial. Now, I mean, it's fair to say that during the 1980s and 90s, some of the culture had started to change in relation to the belief in UFOs, and put a pin in that because I'm going to come back to it. But since 2017, we've seen, I think, what we can only characterize as a disclosure initiative. And really, this has been spearheaded by the organization To the Stars Academy, the TTSA, allied with or working with, let's say, insider Navy, insider Pentagon allies to get stories published in the mainstream media. And it's only been 3 years, and I think it is still fair to say that the shock was very powerful to people following the UFO subject, to read about these stories in the New York Times, for example, and in Politico, for that matter. So it was shocking to people like myself just to see the New York Times cover it, and I think it had to be shocking to a lot of new people who did not follow the UFO subject to see that these admissions, such as that the Pentagon had a UFO program or programs, that the U.S. Navy was experiencing genuine UFOs or UAP, such as the Tic Tac UFO, that they take this phenomenon seriously, and even in the very first article that the Times had, that there appeared to be recovered material from these objects. That was in the 2017 article. They call them mysterious alloys, metal alloys, which we later learned were metamaterials. All of that came out early on, and it was a real shock. But even so, no avalanche followed that, not even close. What we saw was a series of ripples instead. Non-stop ripples, but ripples. So beyond the initial revelations, we quickly had the release of 3 videos, not officially, not by the U.S. Navy, but by really through Luisa Elizondo and TTSA. They were able to get those videos legally, and they were able to release them legally. And the whole process by which that happened, by the way, I still think is very interesting and worth understanding, but I'm going to pass that for now. But even more information followed. Remember the revelations of Bigelow Advanced Aerospace Company, BASS, that the journalism that George Knapp came out with in 2018, that there was a report when they were subcontracting to the ATIP program about these advanced aerial vehicles, these AAVs, as having extraordinary capabilities that seemed well beyond our own technology. Remember that. And then, of course, in June of 2018, the extraordinary speech by Dr. Hal Puthoff of TTSA at the Society of Scientific Exploration, and he's talking about the metamaterial, which, by the way, came through the auspices of Art Bell and Linda Moulton Howe, but then that came into Puthoff's care for a little while so he could study it, and he spoke incredibly candidly about the extraordinary properties of that, very strongly implying to my ears that this did not appear to be anything of human manufacture. And that video, I believe, is still on Vimeo. I think for $5 you can watch it. Absolutely worth watching that. One of the things he mentioned in that speech was that the material, which he said, admittedly, we don't know the provenance, but we had it for years and years and couldn't figure out what this thing did. And then finally science caught up, and we discovered that this material is an outstanding, how did he put it, waveguide for ultra-high frequency radiation terahertz range. And that's quite significant, and it just shows an exceptionally high level of technical capability that, in his estimation, he said, we shopped around, we wanted to find out who could have made this. No one can make this. The the layers of the material are just so ultra fine, nearly at the nano level. Kind of blew their mind. So that was an interesting, quiet revelation that eventually got out there. But we've been really confronting even more pieces of information since then. There was that second New York Times piece in the spring of 2019 that talked about the encounters of the USS Roosevelt off the eastern U.S. coast. Remember that? Some really incredible events that it is difficult, and I think nobody has been able to explain that as U.S. black budget tech. No one's been able to provide any kind of technological explanation, that's for sure, for what some of these objects have been able to do, causing near collisions, by the way, with U.S. Navy aircraft. So that came out in 2019. That was an amazing thing. And there's so many other things that we don't even need to go over everything. But, for example, the official admissions by the U.S. Navy and the Pentagon that they continue to deal with UFOs or UAP, that they have updated their reporting procedures. You've had more recently, the official release of the UFO videos by the Navy. And now we come to the recent pieces in the New York Times from July of 2020 with more explicit statements about, quote, retrievals from off-world vehicles not made on this earth. And that was a statement connected to Dr. Eric Davis, where we learn that he had given briefings to members to the Pentagon and on Capitol Hill about exactly that, retrievals from off-world vehicles not made on this earth. And by the way, for anyone who's been following the saga of the Wilson document that I have been talking about quite a lot for more than the last year, you will notice that the language that was employed in this New York Times article specifically harkens to the language that that document had, which those were notes written by Eric Davis of his interview with Thomas Wilson, and the phrase "not made on this earth" is a clear connection to that document. Just another little interesting way that phrase is now through the back door, as it were, is entering our official parlance here. But the last New York Times pieces, particularly the one that talked about Davis's briefings, in which, by the way, he was accompanied by Chris Mellon, that I think is really important, and that's the thing that you're really seeing a lot of mainstream establishment media following up on. And toward that end, you've got some people saying, well, what does that mean? What was said? Will we ever find out? And there are other folks, other commentators out there saying this is just all a big distraction to take you away from the really important things going on in the world today, and probably everything in between. But I also think the follow-up piece that the New York Times did was also significant, where you've got Leslie Kean and Ralph Blumenthal making, it's kind of like it was an op-ed, essentially, where they're saying, look, UFOs, it's no longer about belief. It's no longer like, do you believe or not believe? Essentially, they were saying, we know this phenomenon is real. And the question is, what are these things? And I thought that they handled this in a somewhat of a coy and definitely a diplomatic way. It was actually a very clever, smart way that they did this. The first thing they said is, well, UFOs doesn't equal alien, and they were really quite emphatic about that. But then in the very next breath, you hear in the article saying, but they also don't appear to be Russian or Chinese, and we're quite sure about that. So you're left with, all right, well, what are these things? The exact same questions, incidentally, that U.S. Analysts in the military were asking back in the 1940s. In other words, these things appear to be real. We don't appear to be making them. Are the Russians making them? And there were people who wondered back then, well, did the Russians invent their own version of a flying saucer? But there really was never any evidence toward that. And which is why, over the years, again and again, Air Force analysts and undoubtedly Navy analysts and other analysts came to the same conclusion, many of them, which was that this appears to be extraterrestrial. That's that. What Leslie Kean and Ralph Blumenthal did in their follow-up piece was smart in the sense that they didn't consciously fill in any blanks for you, the reader. They really kind of left you to decide, well, what's the process of elimination here? Is this U.S. black budget? They didn't really get into that. Doesn't seem to be Russian, doesn't seem to be Chinese. But if it doesn't equal alien, so what are we? You're kind of left to run around in a little bit of a circle there. But I do believe, for discerning minds reading that, maybe UFOs do a little bit equal something from a different civilization after all. They're, I think, very carefully wording it the way they did. So that's where we have come in the space of just 3 years, with really extraordinary revelations from the voice of the establishment. I think that's the thing that's caught a lot of people off guard. And there are a number of questions we could be asking. But question number one, to me, the most important thing is to determine whether or not these revelations are true. And can they be determined to be true or false and so forth? And to me, I would say definitely these revelations appear to be true. There were skeptics and debunkers right out of the gate 3 years ago when the videos were released who went out of their way, it seemed to me, to try to prove that those videos were fake or hoaxes in one way or another. And I think that we can really dismiss those attempts at debunkery now because the Navy itself has acknowledged the legitimacy of those videos. And it really will just show you that a lot of very brilliant, smart debunkers out there doing, I'm sure, what they considered was legitimate work. I don't accuse them of investigating in bad faith, but I do think that those attempts to debunk just show, if you go into something with a preconceived idea of what you're looking at, there's a good chance you're going to find what you think you're looking for. And in this case, they ended up on the wrong side of things. So we need to be asking, is the information true? And I think the information appears to be true. We should also be asking, is the information we're receiving complete? And the answer to that is absolutely not even close. I'm going to come back to that down the road here, so just stay with me. And we can also be asking, and a lot of people are asking, about motives, and motives are important. And it seems to me that there are really two camps that have formed, and there's really two fundamental ways in which you can look at the motives of what we're hearing. So one is this essentially a psyop of some sort? And there are a lot of voices in the UFO field and beyond the UFO field that believe that we're dealing with some kind of, whether it's CIA or some kind of intelligence community operation. Now, for some of those individuals, some of them are straight up UFO skeptics, and if you are a hard skeptic on the matter of UFOs, then it would be logical that you would see, or that you might see this as some kind of psyop. You know, from that point of view, UFOs are a non-reality, or at least non-alien, non-extraterrestrial, that there may be homemade flying saucers. I think there are a lot of skeptics who might believe some version of that. So in this theory, you know, the question would be, well, why are they promoting what appears to be very obviously an ET, even a soft ET version of the UFO reality? There's got to be something going on here, some kind of distraction, some kind of deception. And, you know, one of the common things that one hears is because the Navy and because TTSA, they're clearly working with, has talked about potential threats emanating from these objects, that this could be a scare tactic designed to whip up or accentuate support for the military-industrial complex. I am personally not seeing that, and I will just tell you why. My view is, when I look at the things that TTSA and the Navy have been saying about these UFOs, they mirror very closely a lot of the things that I personally wrote about in my 2 volumes of UFOs and the National Security State. To be perfectly candid, one of the things that I focused on were violations of sensitive airspace by objects that had no logical explanation. And to focus on the fact that the U.S. military, and other militaries for that matter, sure appeared to be taking this thing seriously, despite the fact that they're blowing it off publicly. To me, that was the great discrepancy, and I've always felt it was important to emphasize the fact that there have been military encounters with these things, that there have been engagements, there have been countless violations of sensitive airspace by these unknown objects. That's not saying who's the good guy and who's the bad guy here. That's just saying if you are a military person responsible for defending the security of your airspace, then you have no choice but to consider these things a potential threat. How could you do otherwise and not be negligent in your job, right? So you have to look at it that way. And so I think it's a bit unfair, frankly, to be accusing these individuals of trying to whip up fear by focusing on the potential threat. The other thing that I would just say on this is that from a purely practical point of view, if you're trying to get the attention of a completely brain-dead public, brain-dead political institutions, brain-dead media that for years and years and years has just blown off the topic of UFOs again and again, how do you do it? How do you grab them by the shoulders, as it were, and shake them hard enough so that they actually start paying attention? And it's pretty obvious that one clear-cut method would be to say, hey, pay attention. Something serious is happening here that might actually be affecting national security. It's really not much of a stretch to understand why that would be a tactic. And I personally believe that that is a very important reason why that tactic has been undertaken. So, but anyway, back to the whole idea of whether this is a psyop. You don't have to be a UFO skeptic to think that this might be a psyop. And, for example, I think there are a lot of UFO believers who think that what we're seeing in this 3-year media buildup of UFOs is some kind of a psyop. In other words, with the idea of a highly controlled, sanitized version of the UFO reality that is being rolled out. And I just want to say right here, this has to be considered as an absolutely viable theory. Because the fact is that what is being rolled out through the New York Times articles and even through statements by TTSA can be arguably very sanitized. Now, there may be legit reasons for them to do it the way that they're doing it, but it is undeniable that the focus that you are getting from major media and, even like people like Tucker Carlson, Joe Rogan, and the New York Times, and CNN, of all places, goodness gracious, there's a very targeted message here. And it is still rather sanitized in the sense that all of the history has been siphoned out of the UFO phenomenon. There's no long-standing accusations of cover-up. Hardly anyone even is talking about Roswell, or when they do, it's only in passing. No one is really discussing the implications of 70-plus years of secrecy, 70-plus years of the study of presumably exotic materials, and 70-plus years, very likely, of some kind of interaction by ordinary people with these other beings. No one has gone there. So one could argue that even if you're a UFO believer, what we're getting is a very, very limited sliver of the full reality. So that could be a psyop if that's as far as they ever go. The other way to look at it, though, and I'm just going to say to you, this is still the way that I am tending to look at it, is that this is a genuine effort spearheaded by a few people who actually want this information out for a variety of reasons, very likely. You've got a faction of insiders and allies dealing with enemies, incidentally. And that's been my impression from talking to members of TTSA. And it was also the impression I got. I had a brief chat a little over a year or two ago with Brian Bender of Politico, when I met him at a conference and chatted with him. And he absolutely gave me the same reason to think that there are allies that TTSA has within the Pentagon, and there are definitely powerful enemies. And if I just may say, he didn't make this explicit to me, but I got the distinct impression that he believed the enemies were more powerful than the friends. So I've really been left with the position that this is a small group of people that is really trying to navigate their way through a occasionally and often treacherous path. And I will simply add, in a few conversations that I've had with a number of folks from within there has been a very high level of frustration within TTSA of the lack, in their opinion, of proper media and proper political response to what they've been providing. Now, that doesn't include the last couple of months, because I think things may be moving much faster. But I will say that there's been a long-standing dissatisfaction, and I would almost go so far as to say discouragement about where the media is, and how they're just not really following up on the information that they're dropping. I mean, some pretty heavy things that they have been dropping. And the other reason that I look at these guys as a faction, incidentally, is if you go through the long history of the UFO cover-up. I'm talking even the books by Donald Keyhoe from the 1950s and 60s, Edward Ruppelt, and everything else that we've learned through officially received documentation. There have always been factions within the establishment on this matter. There have always been high-level insiders who have been unhappy with UFO secrecy. And again, I encourage you, go back through the old books of Donald Keyhoe, and you will get a tremendous inside sense of a lot of that, at least from Keyhoe's point of view, because he talked to a lot of those individuals. So there's always been that. And Ruppelt as well, back in the 1950s, wrote quite a bit about this in his book, Report on Unidentified Flying Objects. So what you're seeing with TTSA, I think, actually follows in line with that long history of internal factions that want some openness on this. Now, a little while ago, I mentioned Tucker Carlson, Joe Rogan. What you're seeing is that there are mainstream voices that are following up and talking about this in a way that is actually unprecedented. CNN, for goodness sake. You know, they just did a fascinating interview with Chris Mellon just a few days ago, and like, good grief, if I don't think I've got a link here for that, but it's easy to find. And I mean, the CNN host actually said it's probably time to stop calling UFO believers crackpots. I'm thinking, thanks, CNN. That's really, really nice of you. And then the other thing in that interview, incidentally, was the person asks Chris Mellon, do we actually have, I'm trying to remember the language he used, do we have these artifacts? Do we have, essentially he was asking Mellon, do we have crash retrievals? And Mellon's answer was, again, very smart. He said that assertion should be taken seriously. Very, very careful. So we're seeing an unprecedented opening on this subject, and you cannot underestimate the contribution of people like Joe Rogan on the UFO subject. He's not really a UFO guy per se, but you can tell he's had a long-standing interest in it. Even during his stand-up comedy years, I remember he would talk about this from time to time. But as a podcaster, he's given it very serious and really smart coverage, very targeted, and in a way that is, I think, highly credible and very effective for the public. Tucker Carlson of Fox absolutely is another one. When you're getting Fox and CNN and the New York Times and Joe Rogan all starting to coalesce on something, to say nothing of Popular Mechanics, Scientific American, The Drive, and many other like secondary type sources, you've got to recognize that something important has been changing. The public is talking about this. The public knows now that they can actually talk about this. It's worth asking, is this change fast or slow? And I guess that depends on your perspective. I would say that the change is happening rather rapidly. 3 years may seem like a long time, but when you see where we have been and where we are now, it's actually rather rapid. Think of a number line from 0 to 100, right, with each line being another integer along the way. So 0 would equal total denial and blackout of all UFO information in a society. And let's say 100 equals everything that there is to know, or on everything on UFOs. So for years, in the old truth, the old system, you could say that the public was at or very close to zero on what it knew and what was officially acknowledged about UFOs. During the 1940s and 50s, the whole phenomenon was simply written off as nothing real, or misidentification of natural phenomena and so forth. And as time went by, it seems to me that number crept a bit higher. 1980s, 1990s, cable TV, shows like Sightings, and then the X-Files comes out, and I know that we all know that's fiction, but it really heightened a tremendous amount of interest in the UFO subject. And then you get the internet with information just spreading. So from 0 or maybe 0.5, the level of knowledge maybe got up to 5 out of 100. So still a very low level of, in other words, a level being, well, there appears maybe there's something out there, but maybe the skeptics are right and it's not much to go on. You get this kind of little bit of recognition that maybe there's something there, but it still comes down to a he said, she said sort of a thing, and we don't have any proof. Occasionally there would be shows dealing with abductions, documentaries, but overall, I think it's fair to say through the entire rest of the 20th century, the officially sanctioned level of belief that one would have on UFOs was very, very, very low. Very low. So maybe right now, we have just moved to a higher level. We're at a point where official, established reality is telling us that UFOs are real. Essentially, the New York Times is giving the world permission. I know it sounds ridiculous, but that's really what they're doing. They're giving the world permission to believe that UFOs are real, or to know that UFOs are real. With the New York Times, CNN, and Fox, again, when they all agree on something, you've got to pay attention here. So we're at that level, but we're actually past that level, because the officially sanctioned truths on this are now that we probably sort of do have some artifacts. That's interesting. Once you acknowledge that there are crash retrievals of these things, it becomes very difficult to deny that there's a cover-up. And this is the tricky part of finessing that you can see happening right now in the narrative. They're doing this ever so slowly, ever so gently. Back in the 1970s, when crash retrievals among researchers were really being explored for the first time, I think it's fair to say that UFO researchers immediately understood that if you start getting into crash retrievals, that takes the cover-up to a completely different level. That takes it to the level of, the Air Force or the government can no longer say, well, there's something out there, we don't know what they are. If you've got crash retrievals, they damn well know that there's something there because they've been studying it and they've been hiding it actively from the public. So the reality of crash retrievals takes the whole idea of a cover-up to a very different place. And what we're seeing is a very delicate finessing of this idea of artifacts. They're being very careful. So no one is saying, yeah, we got a piece of a flying saucer. Yeah, we have a fully intact functioning flying saucer. No, none of that. They're saying we've got pieces. We're studying these pieces. And it's also very evident that the word is coming out. And actually, Leslie Kean, I think, probably didn't mean to do this in her interview with Jay at Project Unity. Great interview, by the way, along with Ralph Blumenthal, where she essentially gave the idea that, well, I don't think that we've made very strong progress on the study of these things. And incidentally, I really want to commend Jay for that outstanding interview he did, because he very quickly followed up with Leslie and said, you appear to be referencing the Thomas Wilson notes by Dr. Eric Davis, which made that point explicit of painstakingly slow progress. And poor Leslie, I think she realized I probably said a little bit too much there, and she immediately backtracked in a way that just said, look, I'm just not going to get into this. Again, I encourage you to listen to the exact interview there. The point is, though, that you can see that there's a narrative coming out that there may be crash retrievals, but nothing that we've been able really to understand. And I really want to make this point very clear. So that's where we're at. This is what we're essentially becoming allowed to believe. So let's say that might be level number 10 out of 100. It's definitely far ahead of 0, but it's certainly not the full amount of truth either. And I would really suggest to you that this may be as far as the disclosure goes for a long time. It's entirely possible. And again, this is something else I'm going to be following up on before I'm done here. But that's where we're at now. And what is not included in these revelations is the long history of the subject that's been just taken right out. So there's no question about cover-up. Even now, no one is asking if this is real and if we have artifacts, how the hell has this been kept out of mainstream public circulation after all these years? Where the hell has academia been? Where the hell has the mainstream media been? Where has the scientific community been? And how is it that they have been ridiculing this subject for generations and indeed an entire human lifetime? And what does that say about those institutions? Oh no, we're not even close to asking about that yet, and we definitely need to get to that, because by getting into those issues, you're getting into the story of control over those institutions, or at least deep influence over those institutions by the national security state, the deep state, the intelligence community, however you want to define it, through those relationships. So that all of that history has been removed so far. All right, now, the fact is, all of this sanitizing of the history can be, in this very sanitized form of disclosure, you can look at it in two different ways. As I was saying, you can look at it as a kind of psyop, or you can look at it as, well, like this is really the only way that they can do this process without starting a revolution. For years and years, I used to say it was a truism. I wrote it in After Disclosure, which was that disclosure is impossible and inevitable. It's both. I always used to say it was impossible because, frankly, there's just no motivation by the people who've got this secret to give it up. They lose too much. But I always believed that some form of the ending of secrecy had to be inevitable for the simple reason that our society is rapidly transforming itself in ways that are, it's impossible to predict, and it's way too volatile, and there's way too many growing means by which secrets can come out. So I was saying this back in 2010, 2011, 2012. So here's the thing. If the end of secrecy is inevitable, which it is really, and if you are running the secrecy operation, then at some point you are going to need to refresh that secrecy to keep it current, to keep it believable. You've got to give up something in order to keep the rest secret. This would be a psyop element of the story. So what would the rest be? What would the things that you want to continue to keep secret? Well, I think we can figure it out pretty easily. That there has been a retrieval of actual bodies. Because, frankly, if it starts to come out in any credible way that there have been bodies recovered, that is explosive. That's more explosive by far than even materials. So that's one. And then another thing to keep in secret might be successful reverse engineering efforts. rather than saying no progress or painstakingly slow progress or whatever, what if there has been some success? There are stories, some more credible than others, but some somewhat credible, I would say, that point to such efforts. The famous ARV story from 1988 is one that I personally think seems quite credible to me. But so there's that. Another thing that would be kept absolutely secret, it seems to be of necessity, would be any form of a highly advanced black budget series of breakthroughs, like what I've often called a breakaway civilization, that is a very advanced infrastructure that has formed as a result of the UFO secrecy. And to me, I've often seen something like that as an inevitability. If you've got access to highly exotic technology not made on this earth, and you have total secrecy and an infinite amount of money basically to study it, and a lot of time, you're very likely going to come up with some significant breakthroughs of your own that very likely, for different reasons, would potentially be kept classified themselves and kept away from the public, which would allow your little community in many ways to race ahead technologically. I think that's an absolutely viable theory, and that would definitely be something that would have to be kept secret. I mean, unless you really want to destabilize your society, because there's going to be a lot of angry people if they were to learn that. Another thing that would be kept secret, it seems to me, would be the reality of something like abductions or other types of encounters, even positive encounters. That could very well be something that the power structure would want to keep on the down low in a big way. Another thing that they might want to keep secret, and I'm not saying this is the case, we have to hypothesize here, and we need to be able to entertain all genuine possibilities. And one of those possibilities would be collaboration with these others in some way or another. Is this possible? And I think the answer is yes, it's possible. I don't know that it's the truth, but if you're looking at it from a counterintelligence point of view, and you know that there's the presence of a highly advanced group that is interacting here with Earth in some way or another, and you furthermore get stories by researchers like David Jacobs, and not even just David Jacobs, but a lot of accounts that talk about human-looking beings, but that are not quite like us. I've talked about this a lot over the years, and I've been given these types of accounts from individuals that I have considered quite credible. And I know that I'm not the only researcher. So if there is any form of infiltration that we're dealing with, you can damn well bet that that will be something that would be held onto so tightly that there would be no motivation for that to be given up. So these are things that would be worth preserving as a secret, even if you give up some other levels of the secret. So by that measure, if you look at all these things, then keeping the truth down to something like 10 out of 100 is still doing pretty good. If it's no longer possible to keep it at 0, if you give up a little bit, you get it to a still relatively safe level, and if you can keep it there, well, then you're ahead of the game. And I think that that is an entirely possible way. Now, that doesn't mean that TTSA and their allies are part of the op in that sense. It's really possible that they're not. A genuine faction they may be, and one that is constrained by the environment that they work within. To me, that's actually more logical than that they're taking their marching orders from the CIA or some other group. Maybe they are. I can't say it's impossible, but I think it's much more likely, much more human, much more probable that this is the case, that they are working within a very, very strict set of parameters. Look, trying to bring change to the power elite attitudes very likely would require baby steps. And anything more radical than what they're doing could bring the whole house down, it seems to me. And this is, in fact, I think why they've been totally silent on the Wilson document, incidentally. It was very evident to me when I first learned about that document back in 2006 that the implications of that were shattering, were revolutionary. and that any acknowledgement of the truth of what happened with Admiral Wilson and his saga back in 1997, being denied access to an ET reverse engineering program, for him to admit that would be tantamount to having an entire house of cards come down potentially. And you just knew that that was never going to be admitted to. And look, it's very obvious that these individuals in TTSA are not revolutionaries. Not at all. You might be a revolutionary on this, or someone else might be, but it's obvious they are not. That's not what they're about. And so you can see this whole strategy of baby steps. They, I think, see themselves as part of the system, and they want change within that system. They're not looking to throw the system out. Not really. So that could be their strength, that could be their weakness, but either way, that's, I think, what they are doing. And it also seems to me, and this is just my own assessment of them, very likely, I'm guessing they, or at least some of them, want to be getting a piece of the UFO action, as it were. Maybe they're trying to position themselves to be part of the defense establishment to get contracts, or to have their own influence in one way or another on this matter. You know, human ambition can take a variety of forms, and it seems to me that there's a lot of room for different ambitions and goals that different members in that organization have. So I think they are probably trying to position themselves to be part of that structure. I think they just want in. Now, so they're trying to do that, but here's the thing. Whatever actions they have taken that actually have been potentially quite disruptive to the established truths of the old truths of UFOs, they have actually had a lot of success, but they can stall. Absolutely, these efforts that we're seeing can stall. I mentioned this earlier, and let's revisit this. Will this group, TTSA, supported by the New York Times, getting some support in mainstream media, can they run out of steam? Can the revelations stop, and can they then just fall into irrelevancy? And I think the answer is absolutely yes. And if they cannot or do not produce evidence of bodies, if they do not produce evidence of a complete craft or anything more radical than what they've got right now, we really might see them hitting the end of the road of their revelations. On my own website, Richard Dolan Members, I just did a podcast for folks there, which I call Disclosure by Inches. And it's kind of related to what I'm talking about here, which is when I wrote After Disclosure a full decade ago, my co-author Bryce Zabel and I saw disclosure as a sudden avalanche that could happen due to something unexpected. Our attitude was, the secrecy is on very tight, but there's so much activity going on, and we're now moving into an era where people are better and better able to share information. Something can happen that breaks this, that is unexplainable, that the power structure doesn't know how to deal with, something that cannot be denied, and that would be followed by an obvious announcement and an avalanche of information generated by a public that demanded full disclosure, essentially something revolutionary. I look back now and I think we were probably a little optimistic about the public's ability or willingness to demand full disclosure. It could still happen, but we haven't seen that yet, not even close. What we're seeing right now is the opposite. We're seeing disclosure inch by inch. It's still radical, because the truth is, any UFO disclosure that is officially acknowledged is very strong medicine for the public. All right. The thing is, if the UFO discussion is kept at a sanitized level, and if it doesn't go any further than it goes now, then you could argue that this continues to be part of the cover-up. And not necessarily by design of TTSA or by the New York Times journalists, who I genuinely believe that those journalists do care about this subject. But the cover-up could still continue, even though the ball has moved down the field a little bit. Yes, maybe someone is planning to keep pushing the envelope, but honestly, how are they going to be able to do that? And even with the Wilson document, I can tell you that those people who know the document is real, and frankly, all of the folks in that organization know it's real. All of them know it's real. They also tell me they have no way to prove it either. They can't prove it's real. The folks in this organization, they may be prominent. Some of them may have had high-level intelligence backgrounds and scientific backgrounds. But they've made it very clear to me they don't have the ability to prove a lot more than what they've already been able to talk about. And I definitely get the idea that they are afraid of putting themselves out there in a way that they cannot defend publicly. If they're not bulletproof with this, they don't want to put anything out there that they cannot absolutely defend, because no matter what their level of prominence appears to be, they're not unassailable by any means. And they can easily be attacked by a whole horde of skeptics and journalists and smear artists who will demand things of them that they're not able to provide. So I think they're as stuck as anyone else if they're not able to prove what they think that they know. A couple of other things I just want to ruminate on here with you. I'm going back again 10 years, and I used to, after Disclosure came out, I did a whole bunch of lectures on that theme, and I developed a variety of scenarios, or at least I tried to develop a variety of disclosure scenarios. Like, in other words, asking, disclosure, in our book came out as a result of a sighting that just was totally unexpected, that couldn't be contained. But there's actually a variety of ways that it could happen, and I was trying back then to envision ways that it could happen, and I really came down to 4, maybe 5 different scenarios. One I called fascist or controlled disclosure, kind of a dramatic title for that. One was uncontrolled or accidental disclosure, and that was really the theme of AD. One I ended up calling insider disclosure, and one I called, I remember, people-driven disclosure. And there were different, there were some hits I had in there, and there were a lot of misses that I had in those ideas. But I always gave fascist or controlled disclosure the leading edge as what would be likely. I always considered it the leading candidate. And also that I said over and over again that we're in a foot race. The people are in a foot race against the establishment. And the foot race is, who's going to get to the finish line first? Is the establishment going to be able to create a total global system of control, intellectual control, ideological control, internet control, basically, and also control over people? Are they going to do that first and then roll out a safe, sanitized version of disclosure, which I call fascist disclosure? Or will the people get there first and have a breakout of information and catch the elites off guard and force an avalanche? That's kind of how I envisioned it back then. But I gave fascist disclosure the better chance of succeeding. And I always believed that when you're in a situation where some form of UFO disclosure eventually is going to be inevitable, then the question comes down to, how do you control that disclosure without causing a revolution? And you do it by having total control over the narrative, globally, not just nationally. It has to be a total global control, so that you ensure that fringe voices continue to be in the fringe and marginalized, or as we would now say, deplatformed. We didn't really have that concept more than 5 years ago, but we can see how it can work now. Web control, media control, marginalization of dissent, and a dumbed down public, toxified really by bad education, bad food, bad culture, too distracted by a toxic culture really to understand anything. And 10 years ago I was thinking, is that what's going to happen? And here we have really moved down that road. And back in 2010, 2011, I thought, well, maybe this will happen within 20 years. And even then it seemed very radical for me to be saying those things, like, yeah, within 20 years there's going to be total control over everything. Well, no, it happened a lot faster. It's happened within 10. the control system has really been formalized, I think, over the last 5 years for sure. So I wish it were a prediction that did not come true, but I think it is a prediction that is coming true. And again, it's not to say that TTSA is actually consciously part of that system of controlled disclosure. They very well may not be, and I personally think that they're not. But it doesn't mean that what they're doing can't be co-opted by a higher establishment that is able to contain what they've got and actually use what they've given as a way to satisfy the public, to make the public think, yeah, well, this is the new truth. I think it was Alan Dulles, former CIA director, who said the best way to keep a secret is to pretend to share it. So, again, I just want to come back to a few things of what we have been learning here. When it comes to the news, the information that's come out of places like the New York Times, or some interesting interviews done over at Fox by Tucker Carlson, or even the CNN interview, the most important thing is to analyze the evidence that is offered. And we have to ask, is there extraordinary evidence that is being offered to us, and do we have the ability to investigate it? And I think the answer to that is yes and yes. We can also ask, are the current revelations in line with what good research has told us over the years? And I think the answer to that is yes. In other words, the performance of the Tic Tac UFO is, as reported by rock-solid witnesses like Commander David Fravor, that is exactly in line with UFO reports that we've gotten from other military witnesses over many, many years and decades. You know, I've talked a number of times about a particular sighting that I'm proud that I found 15 years ago in the Canadian National Archives, and it just concerned a sighting that took place in the middle of nowhere on planet Earth, in a remote region of the Northwest Territories of Canada, in a region known as the Barren Lands, where nothing even grows, a land of infinite lakes, and that's about it. Lots of fish. And in the 1980s, a very elderly gentleman wrote to the Canadian National Research Council, which was the official repository back in those days of UFO reports. Not that they investigated anything, they just put them into a file and left them alone. But this was an elderly man who said, I just want to write this down for posterity's sake. And he said, back in 1936, when I was 25 years old, I had a very interesting job working for the Canadian government to do aerial topography and photography, essentially to take photographic information of, I'm sure he was part of a large team of people to do this, to photograph this region that no one had been able to get up to before. But now with aviation being what it was, he was able to do it in one of those awesome pontoon planes that could land on the water and so forth. So he described where he was as utterly remote region, and he said, on this one afternoon in 1936, I just was doing a pre-flight check of my aircraft. I looked straight up into a perfectly blue sky, and I saw what he called the most perfect configuration of an airship one could imagine. And as he described it, it was exactly described as a Tic Tac UFO, except it wasn't white, but it was more like gunmetal gray with no reflection whatsoever, despite the fact that it was in broad daylight with no clouds anywhere. He said it didn't reflect, it was just in this slightly elongated north-south configuration. He said, I watched it turn to east-west. He said it was so smooth and rapid, he said, was hardly detectable to the eye. And he said, and then it instantly took off to the east at an ungodly rate. He said it was at the horizon in moments. No sound, nothing like that. No markings. And you can imagine this stuck with him for more than 45 years, and then he finally writes about it to the Canadian government. And I don't think anyone read that encounter until I read it in going through the archives. So you could say, well, that's not an official military report, and that's true, but I will simply say I found it very credible, and I believe that story, and I think it's a reasonable thing to believe that story, frankly. And if it is true, then we're looking, that's a sighting from prior to World War II. What is this thing doing out there where there's no human habitation for many hundreds of miles? And what was it doing there? And, all of these questions. So my point in bringing this up is simply that what we have been learning in the recent New York Times and related revelations by TTSA is these encounters actually are totally consistent for a long period of time, and they ring of the truth. And so that's the most important thing we need to be asking about the current information coming out is it true? Secondly, we can ask about motivations. I talk about this a lot because, honestly, I find it a bit unsettling, a bit frustrating when there are a number of really very smart analysts out there, but they go to the motivations first before they really go to the information. So the motivations being, well, all of these people have intelligence community backgrounds, therefore we really can't trust anything they're saying. And it is true, like you want to know what the background of these people are, but you don't want to be studying the background at the expense of actually listening to what they are saying. Because when you do that with anyone, you're doing a whole lot of things, but what you're not doing is listening. And frankly, that's the best way to ruin a relationship, it's the best way to ruin a friendship, it's the best way to wreck a society, which is anytime something is said to you, you're not actually listening to what they're saying, but you're asking yourself, what's their real motivation for telling me that? Like if you say that about your girlfriend or your boyfriend, guess what? That's not going to last very long. And it's the same with any friendship, and it is the same with people as well. As a society, we need to be remembering what is important, and what's important is the information, and can it be verified? Secondarily, or even less than secondarily, is who it's coming from. The most important thing is the information itself. And I really do believe we get stuck all too often on what we think we can divine the motivations of these other people being, as if we're smarter than they are and as if we know more than they do. And, a lot of times it's not true. We're not smarter than they are, and we don't know more than they do. And we're really better off, in my view, sticking to the facts and confirming or falsifying the facts. Now, there's people saying that this UFO news is a distraction from the real news. You hear this. I just read another article this morning. I think it was over at Zero Hedge, which I enjoy reading. And I thought, I don't agree with you that you think this particular article said, this is just a distraction. It's all an op. You might ask, what if the UFO disclosure, what if it's the other way around? What if UFO disclosure is being aided by the craziness in the world right now? So if you're going to do a disclosure of something as radical as the UFO subject, maybe now is a good time to be pushing it while people basically are looking elsewhere in the world at a whole bunch of other craziness, from COVID to riots and protests to everything else. Yes, I think maybe 2020 is turning out to be not a bad year to push a UFO disclosure, simply if you are trying to get the information out. Getting it out in a soft way is actually safer than having all eyes on it all at once. I think now it's become clear that an inch by inch, step by baby step form of disclosure is actually the safest form of it from the point of view of those people who've got power who don't want to rock the boat too much. Slow and steady, and I think that is their motivation. So where to next with all of this? Where's this all going? Will any of these disclosures actually lead to something? So far, really what they've led to is a change in public opinion, and that is not trivial. That is not trivial. Years ago, again, I remember thinking about this at least 10 or more years ago, and I remember thinking, like, if you really want to change laws and politics, you've got to change the culture first. And I used to look at the example of how radically our culture changed in its assessment of something like gay marriage. And if you go back to the 1980s and 90s, I don't remember what all the numbers were, but in pretty much every Western country, it was like 80-20 against or something like that. And within the space of one generation, it essentially reversed. It was an astonishing change. And after it became evident that public opinion essentially reversed itself on this matter, that's when you start seeing the laws change. It's very instructive. And I think, it occurred to me that way, way, way many years ago, like if the UFO culture could be changed in some way to get a large number of people to transform openly on the matter of UFOs, that would be a necessary way to get legal change, if that's even possible, on the UFO subject. That's how I thought of it years ago. And one thing that we can see is that there has been a change in public opinion. Now, we still, that's only one little thing. The fact is, honestly, we are in the midst of a transformation of all of human civilization. I haven't even gotten into any of this here, but lately I've been calling it the fourth stage of humanity, and I actually really believe this now. So I think that human beings have gone through three fundamental stages of existence, and only three. We've had a lot of variations in our societies, of course, but the three have been hunting and gathering, agriculture and settled communities, and in the last 300 years or so, industry and science. And that's it. And everything that we've seen is a subset of one of those three. Hunting and gathering, 200,000 years. Settled sedentary agriculture, really the last, say, 10,000 years when we started doing that. And in really the last 3 centuries or so with industry and science, which revolutionized us again. And I do believe we're moving to a fourth fundamental transformation, which includes universal 5G, universal surveillance over populations, strong AI, genetic tweaking, genetic manipulation, maybe a form of transhumanism. That is fundamentally reconfiguring human civilization right now. So I'm calling it humanity's fourth stage. And you got to ask yourself, so we're moving toward this disclosure, but there actually are other things going on which are every bit as big or bigger. 50 years ago, people would typically say, well, if we could admit that aliens were here, that would be the biggest thing by far in all of human history. It's crazy to say, but I don't think that that's the case anymore, necessarily. It all depends on the details. All depends on the details. But you got to ask yourself, in the next 20 years, 30 years, with all the changes that we're going to be seeing in our greater civilization, how big will UFO disclosure be within this greater sea change? And maybe not as big as we used to think. And especially if the revelations are contained at a low level. Because the fact is, there's going to be a lot of other realities that are going to be competing with the UFO reality. And here's a big what if. What if there is an active presence of other beings here on Earth right now, an active non-human presence? And we really want to ask, does this disclosure by inches that I'm talking about suit the needs of those beings, those people, those others? Does it suit their needs? And I would say, yes, it does. It suits their needs just fine. Now, it would also, because it would suit their needs because your eyes are not on the prize, right? You're looking at, oh, we've got these little trinkets, these little artifacts, we can't really understand it. Meanwhile, there's this whole other thing going on that you're not aware of. But even if you don't think that there's an alien presence that's infiltrated our society, it would also suit the needs of a rapacious human elite that realizes they've got to give up some information in order to keep the rest. So this very, very slow level of disclosure that could very well halt would work very much in their interest. In other words, what has been released up to this point is not enough to cause a revolution, not even close. So what this means is that it is essential for researchers and, yes, activists to keep pushing the information that they have on the UFO matter if they actually want truth. And I say if, and we take it as a given that, yes, of course we want the truth, but you really have to ask yourself long and hard if you want the truth on this. What will the full truth on this do? Now, let me just be very clear. I believe very strongly that the public needs to know the full truth on what is going on. And And I don't pretend that I have every answer on what is going on at the deepest levels. But I think we need to be prepared for the possibility that it's not all what we would like to see, that there may be things that are really upsetting. So we've got to be able to deal with it and face it, it seems to me. I think very likely those of us who are diving deep into this subject, we're not going to be satisfied by the public being at number 10 out of 100 of all the information that's there. But it is worth asking, what happens to society if we really learn the full truth? And that actually is why Bryce Zabel and I wrote AD After Disclosure, because for us, we really wanted to explore the full impact of the full coming out of this whole reality and what it might do to our society. And I have no problem saying that we probably underestimated a lot of the changes and transformations. And even what we got into was really pretty radical. So I don't really know if anyone else has even followed up on that type of a study to this day. It's been 10 years, but we really gave it our shot. And if you're interested in looking into that, maybe you want to read the book. But it's worth asking, how much truth will future human society be able to process? And I'm speaking of a world that really may develop without genuine economic prospects for a lot of people. A world with, we're talking about universal basic income now, UBI, in a way that before the pandemic, I don't think people were really talking about it at all, but now it's a genuine part of the global conversation, at least of Western civilization. And that's a very interesting thing, because if you've got a structural unemployment of 20, 30% or more, which really could be the case in the future, in a highly bureaucratized, highly legalized, highly managed society where it's entirely possible that the kinds of wide open opportunities for economic development may not exist in a future society. And so you've got to support these people with essentially a form of welfare. And what kind of culture will that create? Well, it will be one that is supported by total surveillance and total ideological control, ubiquitous entertainment and gaming, and basically garbage education. That's what's going to happen. Because, if you're one of those people at the top and you've got to manage this great herd of humanity that's got nothing to do, nothing really to motivate themselves for their own goals in life, then you better damn well be distracting them to the best of your abilities while they are there. And so that's, I think, what we can look at. And if that's going to be a lot of the world, that's not a world that's going to be able to be processing a whole lot of truth, it seems to me. So, I used to marvel that UFO disclosure and the human transformation and advanced AI that we're saying, I used to marvel that these seem to be happening at the same time. Like we were moving toward a disclosure moment, and we were moving toward a punctuation in human civilization, a transformation. Now, I wonder if the one is in danger of being gobbled up by the other. That is UFO disclosure in danger of being gobbled up by the transformation in the society that we're seeing? The coming transhumanist 5G AI surveillance society may not, after all, be one in which the truth sets us free. We have to be prepared to fight for the truth more now than ever before, I believe. And also, this is worth thinking about. We really want to ask ourselves if we are worthy of the truth. Because to deal with the full truth about almost anything, sometimes harsh and disruptive truths especially, you'd better be really, really strong. So overall, I would say that I think the recent New York Times information is not trivial, even though it came a little bit as a disappointment to people in the UFO field, without a doubt, actually. But I think it's now possible to see the strategy of what is happening here. They are taking safe little baby steps. I can appreciate that. They don't want to turn society inside out. Okay, we get that. I think that their motivations are good in this regard, or at least I think that the people who are presenting it the way they are doing it because this is what they believe is genuinely the best thing to do. But the danger is going to be whether that caution of theirs is being co-opted by a larger and more powerful secrecy system that honestly is just able to move the goalposts a little bit further back and to keep the basic system intact with no changes, no real openness for at least another, who knows how long, another human lifetime, maybe even longer. That, I think, is what we're not going to know for a while, but I think we should assume that that is probably the plan. You know, they'll keep the secrecy for as long as they are able to keep the fundamental important elements of the secrecy. That's, I think, what the plan is. You give up what you're able to give up, what you have to give up, and you keep everything you're able to keep. Well, I definitely want to return to this theme moving forward. For now, I think I'll just say thanks for being here with me, and I will catch you next time. And remember, while we learn and grow and search for the truth, let's try to be good to each other. Later.